gave us no matter and no examples. Their previous speaker basically called what Nathan told you about London, China, and Brazil as essential outliers and never really told us as to why these things essentially should not be done. In particular to our referendum, in particular to our valiant attempt to protect the investments of investors and the reputation of governments, which my partners already talked about. Before I move on to my two issues in this debate, let's first rebut or respin a lot of things they said. Because the previous speaker pretty much gave a lot of unstrategic concessions and principled concessions ultimately. Firstly, we think when he talked about how they are already doing research and development to the business plans, we think, ladies and gentlemen, in Nathan's speech, he already talked about how status quo can fail. And he talked about how even if you do these business plans, there is a likelihood of failure and ultimately a net loss, where you can no longer pay these people back. A question up until now which remains unanswered as to where will the money come from? How will you be able to pay back the reparations and sunken costs of all of these lost infrastructure and people who were harmed along the way, whose houses were taken because you had to build infrastructure? And we think that on the second level, Nate already talked to us about how they conduct these business plans for their investors to be able to know how much they have to shell out to begin with, but ultimately that shows in status quo, it's still not enough. The numerous examples he already gave you. So they have to be able to tell us why status quo is something working and why a referendum isn't essentially necessary. Secondly, he conceded that people might not want it. And ultimately, that's a principled concession to the minority argument of Therese. She talked about how people essentially who are taxpayers don't want it, might not want it, might subscribe to the fan base, might not, might have work on that day, might not, might want to go, might not, and ultimately there's still the principled reason as to why they should be asked. Because their hard-earned money is going to the creation of all this infrastructure which ultimately might not benefit them at the end of the day. As opposed to the characterizations he tried to talk about, which is public roads and infrastructure, which ultimately everyone uses, or more often than not, people are going to use with respect to commerce. And these things are also relatively permanent, as opposed to the infrastructure created in China, which was used for 2 weeks, and up until now, ladies and gentlemen, it is a ghost town. No one is there, it is a sunken cost, a lot of government spending was essentially put to waste. People don't know what to do with it. Next, he tried to talk about how we have referendums for other things. It doesn't call for it in this debate. Maybe that's the reason why we're having a debate to begin with, to be able to extend a referendum in this particular situation. So you can't just tell us that its definition stands for something else without giving us concrete middle analysis as to why this should be done. Lastly, he talked to us about how politicians are short-sighted and ultimately will fulfill their projects to be re-elected. Ladies and gentlemen, that is precisely why they won't be able to feel the long-term harms anymore, because they won't be in office anymore when people potentially lose money. And ultimately, who do the people in government have to blame if these people have already washed their hands clean because they were able to garner a reputation, be re-elected, and eventually earn some money on the side, the kickbacks Nate essentially talked about. Two issues in this debate. In principle, should a referendum be conducted in relation to taxpayers' money, talking about first class with Therese and him, and secondly, talking about the pragmatics, which is the nature of investment, something they talked about, which up until now remains ultimately unresponded to. On the first idea, right? Therese already outlined how hard-earned money of taxpayers goes to these sporting events. But furthermore, we tell you that more often than not all of these people subscribe to these fan bases. We have to be able to dissect that idea of a fan base, right? Majority of them just watch these things online, where it's free and essentially have to pay copious amounts of money to fly to that location or even go there. Because we're talking about large cities, right? It's not like the Philippines where you can just book a quick ticket and go there on a bus. And we think that even if they do subscribe it, and even though they want it, there is still a relative moral imperative for governments to be able to ask people, do you want this to begin with? Because not everyone falls within one side of the spectrum who ultimately want it. We stand for the minority who might essentially be against this bidding. On the second level, right, we have to talk about the costs of marketing for bidding, something Nate also talked about. Because bidding as a process is not a guarantee that they'll even be able to win, right? But they even spend a copious amount of money being able to have marketing material to be able to get relative support from the international sporting community to show that our event can be awesome, right? And we think there's ultimately another harm also, wherein these people are able, or the sporting community is able to win that bid because now all of the intangible business plans they're talking about have to be made real. And ultimately, that's where real life comes into play, and a multitude of scenarios can happen. They can be profitable, great for those people who want to be re-elected, and ultimately, they can also lose money. A shame to all of these people whose houses were reclaimed, and ultimately lobbied against it, couldn't go to work in London, and ultimately were harmed in the process. So we think it's ultimately important for these people. But before 6, yeah, you want. Anyway. Okay, now what exclusive things have we talked to you about in our side, right? Exclusively, we were actually given to you the principle of why a referendum is the exact way or precise way to be able to get people and ask them what they want. We think definitely on our side of the house, we can still have these business plans and be able to push through with a relative project which is ultimately going to be successful, but we err on the side of caution on several levels where we ask people if they want it to begin with. Because if our people say no, then who will be able to come to the games? Who will be able to support and bring the critical mass throughout the entire world, i.e. preventing London from ultimately not happening because they were at a net loss? We were also a more engaging team, right? This is me kind of replying already because they didn't really give us much substantive, right? Nathan's case up until now essentially still stands. And if they're trying to co-opt the benefits we're talking about, they have to be able to essentially say why it can happen on their side. But on our side, we're exclusively telling you referendums are important and business plans are still going to be in place. At least we have a security, we have a safety net, and we have a check and balance to keep greedy politicians at play, and we control the potential volatility of these business plans. Because like I talked about in my POI earlier, we can't see the future, we don't know what will happen, but we have to err on the side of caution. So with all these reasons and more, we are proud to stand in government. Thank you. We're taking this debate.